Hi, folks. Thanks for sticking through the day and sticking around for this. So my talk is, Noah asked me to speak here, and I was like, well, about what? And he was like, I don't know, what do you. And so I thought I would give, I like to, this talk on a high level is kind of addressing what, I've heard it referenced here before too, what Kate Compton's called the oatmeal problem, where you can have unique content, but it's just another bowl of oatmeal. You don't, it's not actually that interesting. So this is sort of my thoughts on creating interesting procedural content, specifically around contexts of games, but informed by other things that I've done. So I'll make this a little bigger. So I make Twitter bots. One of them is 2 headlines. It takes 2 headlines from the news and swaps their subjects. So Alphabet carries out country's first back-to-back executions in almost 2 decades. Hungary is really boring. WWE displays military prowess with failed missile launch. Purdue buys Europe will create new nonprofit chain. And this is one of these recurring themes in what I make, which is that it's really dumb. Like it's conceptually dumb, but it's also dumb in terms of how it does what it does. This is not using AI or neural nets or anything like that. I just go to Google News, I find 2 headlines, I scrape the topic from the sidebar, and then I swap them. That's it. Let's see. Here's this. Oh, sorry. This one is Miraculous Pictures, which is making fun of those image accounts that are really spammy. So that's a gang of teen girls in Estonia circa the 1930s. And on the right, you have the last known Tasmanian tiger, sadly now extinct. So anyway, I have many of these. This is a more recent one, Expanding Bot. This just uses... This just traverses ConceptNet. It just starts with a concept and then just goes up and then puts the brains next to it, and that's it. That's all it does. It took me half an hour. I also make tools and things. One of the tools that I have that might be relevant to people in this room is called Corpora. It's a collection of stuff, but it's in machine-readable JSON format. So there's lists. It's just a GitHub repo, and it's just lists of animals and archetypes and architecture and art and colors and corporations and divinations and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of, and it's all Creative Commons public domain. So it's basically, I made it mostly as a teaching tool, because when I teach like how to make a Twitter bot workshops, you can easily waste hours on trying to find and scrape data sources. So I was like, why don't we just put a bunch of really kind of simple, small data sources in one place. And so a lot of educators use this, but also a lot of people use it for their tracery bots, for example. And some people have even made tools that take tracery and corpora and put them together, and then you can just pick and choose from different corpora lists and make your tracery bot, which I think is pretty neat. I founded a few years ago National Novel Generation Month. It's happening right now. It happens alongside NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. I thought it would be interesting to do a month where coders compete to see who can make code that writes a novel. So we've been doing it for 13, 14, 15, 16. This is the 5th year, actually, of National Novel Generation Month. We have about 100 people participating right now. And it's just it's another just Git repo. You can find it if you Google for NaNoGenMo. And I encourage anyone here, especially if you're interested in generating long-form content. It's really cool because we have a bunch of resources in a big thread every year, and also everyone who enters is required to share their source code. It might not be open source, but it's at least exposed source, so you can read it and get ideas. So I encourage you to look through these and find things that you think are cool, and then go check out the source code for how they were made. One example, which I'll come back to later. This is my favorite book from any NaNoGenMo. Was Emily Short's Annals of the Paraguays. Anyway, it's like all NaNoGenMo books. It's a full book, And this one, it's kind of a travel guide to these different provinces in a sort of England-like place. And she gave a great talk at, I think, Proc Jam last year that you can find about how she made this. And I'm going to come back to this later, but this is one of the few NanoGenmo books that I find actually really, for real, readable from start to finish, and I would rather read it than, say, 50% of human novels. So, I also co-founded a company called Field Train with my spouse. We do a lot of generative work for different companies. Among other things, we've done work for the Dungeons & Dragons folks. So we'll make Twitter bots for them that do generative stories and scenarios, and people can interact with their official Twitter account and get kind of custom content. And so this one is, they gave us a bunch of character art, and then we sort of generated 140 character stories about the different characters. So this is all kind of like leading up to, it's just to give you a sense of the breadth of the kind of stuff that I end up doing. Let me zoom out, zoom in, come on. Oh, that's an iframe, that's what's happening. Come on, 1 second. There we go. I was a game developer for 10 years before I started doing web stuff, before I started doing weird internet stuff. So it was just, so it was like 2003 to 2013. I was doing professional game dev at big studios, and I also had my own kind of side projects that I would do. And I noticed after a while that I would sit down to like make a roguelike or to make a, you know, Final Fantasy Tactics type game or to make a, you know, whatever. And I would have a lot of fun building the map generator or character generators or whatever. And then I would immediately lose steam and stop working on the project. Around that time I wrote, around that time I wrote, I was playing a lot of games. I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about, you know, roguelikes that I like, or roguelites that I like, or action roguelites that I like. Probably the top two that I would say are Liberal Crime Squad, which was by the Dwarf Fortress brothers before they did Dwarf Fortress. Love Liberal Crime Squad. I play it all the time still. And Hoplite, which was a 7-day roguelike entrant, and it sort of did a fantastic job of saying, what if roguelikes but with good combat? And yeah, Hoplite I still play every single day. I haven't stopped for a few years now. And I'm going to be coming back to these. Around this time, around 2013, I wrote Fuck Video Games, which is about the sort of process of me realizing that, wait a minute, if I actually just care about procedural generation and I don't actually care about coming up with rules for people to interact with things in a world, then maybe I can just do procedural generation and like throw away the game. And so that's what I did. I started making Twitter bots and things like that. And so like generative art, broadly speaking, but a lot of it I was bringing my game development skills to because it very much transferred over. So I want to talk a little bit about randomness and that oatmeal problem, and art and aesthetics in general. Code is weird. So for example, this bit of pseudocode can generate more content in a few seconds than you will ever be able to consume in your life. It's completely unique. It's amazingly, well, it's not amazing at all. It's just a bunch of digits. But that's what it is. It's super unique content. Everyone gets something different out of it, and it sucks. I think a lot about mappings between linguistic stuff and physical generation. So sometimes a lot of people like to go to Markov as their first sort of a shot at language generation. And you know, you get something that's shaped like English a little bit. This is some Shakespeare. To die, that is sicklied, or with a bare bodkin, who would bear to be wished? To be that flesh is sicklied of us, rather bear the native hue of us pause. There's the slings of death, the resolution devoutly to take's calamity of thought. And on the right, we have basically a Perlin noise landscape generator. And just like the thing on the left generates English-ish language, the thing on the right generates geological-ish formations. And at a glance, they look pretty good. But once you spend more than like 10 seconds with one of these things, you get bored almost immediately. There's nothing that interesting about these things, except in like maybe like if you're like me and you like to take things apart, okay, that's cool. You can sort of figure out how it works. But just as an aesthetic object in and of itself, these are very low interestingness. And so I sometimes think about this stuff as like the Thomas Kincaid paintings of procedural art, where it's just like, well, we're gonna put some pretty stuff up, and that's gonna be enough. And I like the stuff that I consume to have disruptive elements in it. Not like shocking necessarily, but just think of a big flat rectangle in the middle of this or something. That would be more interesting to me than this. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the most important achievement, in my opinion, in procedurally generated art of the last 10 years. It's Spelunky by Derek Yu. And specifically, I want to talk about the level generation. Some of you might be familiar with this website that I built. It's a live deconstruction of a level generator in Spelunky and how it works. Spelunky's open source. The original one is open source, so I was like, cool, I can write a mod that turns it into a vivisection, basically. So what you see here is a level from the first area of Spelunky, the caves, and we can generate new maps. So I actually have several layers here. Those numbers sort of dictate the way that the path snakes through from the top to the bottom. So like a 0 tile has an exit to the right, a 1 has an exit guaranteed to the left and the right, a 2 is going to be T-shaped, a 3 is going to be T-shaped but upside down. And then there's special tiles, like the snake pits are all 8s and 9s. And those are the literal enums that are just in the code. I didn't make up those numbers. Derek made up those numbers. And so I can generate new layouts of those. So there we go. So this is just generating, wait, that's not, hold on. Well, it's keeping the overall layout. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. These are completely new layouts. And so you can get a sense for how it's different and how it's the same in places. You'll also notice that I've colored in a few tiles over here. So we have these white tiles, and then it's a little hard to see, but there are sort of red shaded tiles as well, and some of those overlap with transparency. And so I can vary those. I can vary the layouts of the individual rooms, but keep the whole level the same. I can vary just the red areas, which are these sort of obstacle blocks. So if you'll like watch this tile, it's always going to have a ceiling and a floor down here, but this red area is going to change pretty drastically. So you can get a sense of the texture of that room, but how it changes from generation to generation. And then lastly, we have these white tiles. Like if you watch like this tile right up here, and those are just tiles that say there is a 50% chance of a rock being here, for example. So those are like probabilistic tiles, I call them. Anyway, first thing I want to do is just make an appeal to the developers in the room. You can do this with your own stuff. It's pretty easy for you because you wrote the game, actually. Especially if your game runs in like a web browser context already. So if people are bugging you, oh, how does the How does the level generation work? Making this as a game developer is way easier than writing a big long essay about or giving a talk about how you did the thing. And it's also going to be way more helpful to anybody. There's actually a whole bunch of roguelikes that I'm aware of who have, the authors have reached out to me and said, hey, I based the level generation in my roguelike entirely on your little, toy here. It's like, great, that's awesome. So that's just an appeal to the people in the room who might be in a position to do this sort of thing. So why do I think this is the greatest achievement in procedural art of the last 10 years? Well, good question, me. So it's an interesting mix of elegant and non-elegant rules. So for example, the rule for where treasure is placed is literally just the probability of there being treasure on a given tile is directly proportional to the number of walls surrounding a tile. So what that means is you end up with, there's not a huge chance that there's going to be treasure right in the middle of the floor here because it's only got one wall tile and that's underneath it. But in a little nook somewhere, there's very likely to be treasure because it's bound on three sides. And if there happens to be an empty tile in the middle of a big solid rock, there's a very good chance there will be a treasure there, and that's actually kind of a cool feature. So that's just like an elegant example. But that's it's one line of code. It's just that, but in code. Then there's not elegant rules too. This is the rule for placing a giant spider in a level. If we are in the first cave tile set, then for every brick tile that is not the ceiling of the level itself, and is not in the shop, and is not in the starting room, and is not on the bottom half of a room, check to see if we have a 2x2 block of empty tile space below this brick. If there's a 2x2 block of empty tile space and we're allowed to generate a giant spider in this level, and we have yet to generate a giant spider in this level, then there is a 1 in 40 chance that we generate a giant spider and some cobwebs right beneath this brick. If we do generate a giant spider, make sure not to generate another one in this level. And so, that's just a bunch of if-thens, but that's the English language version of all those rules for how we place a giant spider in a cave level. And what I learned by modding Spelunky and taking apart and of course playing it a whole bunch is that the level generators in Spelunky are this really interesting mix of sort of templated authorship. So there's a lot of, if I go back to that, this thing here, about 30% of the tiles in any given room layout are completely deterministic and designed by the author. So this is always going to be a brick. This is always going to be a brick. Then there's some, and actually if I count the empty spaces that are always going to be empty, it's probably more like 60, 70%. And then what the author did was he took, he smartly placed probabilistic tiles and obstacles and things like that, just enough to make it seem different every time. But also the sameness kind of helps. I don't know how many of you have played a ton of Spelunky like me, but you get to a point where you're playing that game where you enter a room and you're like, subconsciously you're like, I've never been in this room before, but I know this is the room where if I make a running start and then jump off this ledge, I am likely to land on a platform on the other end. You start to get an intuitive sense of the underlying shape and rhythm of the different templates. So that's what I mean by the templated part. And then there's the random input, which is just the random number generator, and that's the things like those probabilistic tiles. And there's layers upon layers upon layers of those. So he's definitely taking advantage of the explosive combinatorics here. So there's never too many decisions to make about one individual thing for the computer, but of course you layer, then you end up with that, 55 choose 7, scenario where there's like a zillion different things. And then context, which I think is actually super important. I'm going to talk about a little bit. I'm going to back up and talk a little bit about a Twitter bot that I made. Or this wasn't a Twitter bot. This was a sort of a web toy. But so this is the word earthquake, and that's a definition of the word earthquake. I'm pulling it from an API that tells me the definition of a word. What up, WordNick, if anybody uses WordNick. So, earthquake, a sudden and violent shaking of the ground, sometimes causing great destruction as a result of movements within the Earth's crust or volcanic action. Okay, I pulled a word out of a hat and then I looked up its definition. And I can also, come on, this is finicky. Oh no. That's not working. Oh well. It was supposed to grab new words and put them there. But basically, all I have to do is add a couple of words in a picture and suddenly it's a joke generator. Girl, you must be an earthquake because you are a sudden and violent shaking of the ground, sometimes causing blah, 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 blah. And so that's the difference in context here. This is just a definition, and this is a joke generator. And when you're making a game, I think your game itself, like the rules of the game, are the context. Like the Spelunky level generator thing that I just showed you, it's the level generator, it's there, but it's kind of empty and lifeless except for the snakes that I forgot to delete from the world placer thing. And it's, you know, it's again, abstractly interesting, maybe in the way that Markov was abstractly interesting, but it only becomes interesting once you're running and jumping around in it. I could have a level generator as good as or better than what Derek made for Spelunky, but if the running and jumping part didn't feel good, if the collision detection was off, if the controls were floaty, any number of problems, then it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter at all. And also, nobody would look at that game and say, "Wow, the level generation is good." They just wouldn't, partly because they wouldn't notice it, but also the level generation wouldn't be good. If the height of the Spelunky guy, if his jump was calibrated too high or too low, then those levels wouldn't be coherent as levels anymore. So there's all this context around the stuff that you generate that really can drastically change how people perceive and how people feel the stuff that you're making. Another example of context, I'm going to go back to, well, I won't go back to it because you'll remember it because you're not, you have persistence of memory. But so two headlines from earlier. What two headlines does is it takes, two headlines and it swaps them. And there was that one headline, Alphabet to carry out back-to-back beheadings for the first time, right? It's still getting some chuckles, right? But that's because you know what Alphabet is. If I made up a company, Tech Corp or something, and then I said Tech Corp about to, commit to do back-to-back beheadings, no chuckles there, right? Like, so what it's playing off of is the context of the familiarity of the now. It's talking about what is in the news right now. So it's funny because it's relevant. This is the great trick that late night talk show hosts play, is that they don't have to be as funny as like a comedy film that's meant to stand the test of time. They just have to be funny enough and relevant to the context of the moment. That's why nobody like collects DVD box sets of The Tonight Show. Like, I mean, some people do, presumably, but they don't even make those for things like The Daily Show, because why would you watch old Daily Show episodes from 2005? Like it just wouldn't be. Again, it would be abstractly interesting as like a comedic historian or something, but it would not be actually funny or good. Hoplite, again, this is a game that I have played more or less every day for 4 years now. So I would say very high replayability, but there's not actually any, like the level generator is pretty much what you're seeing right here. For all I know, the level generator is just, well, we draw the big, arena, we draw some blobs of lava, the end, and then we randomly place enemies down. They have a couple of rules to make sure that your first move, you have a guaranteed first move, it doesn't kill you, but that's about it. at least as far as I can tell from my many years of playing this. And it works because it doesn't have to be any more complex than that. One of the best game development tricks I learned was more about artificial intelligence, but it was from a talk given by Brian Reynolds back in 2004 or 2005, and he was talking about designing the artificial intelligence for the game Rise of Nations, and he said, when we make AI for games, we always start out with X equals RND3, we just pick a strategy at random, and if we play test it and it works, great. We didn't have to waste any time designing AI for this thing. And so that's, and I really took that to heart. And so all the stuff that I make as stupid as possible until it gets a laugh out of 1 out of every 100 people who see it. And then I'm like, great, that's good enough. And I move on to my next project, ship it. And so, yeah, and Hoplite is an interesting enough and tense enough game design that you can just throw enemies down at random. I mean, random, again, you're never going to have 100% wizards in a level, for example. There will always be a distribution, but more or less, it's certainly not what someone would consider a high-level, procedural content generator. So I just want to, come back to that templated authorship, random input, context. I think that stuff is super important. This book again, Annals of the Paraguays, I don't know, by Emily Short, does this incredibly well. It's clearly templated because it's a repetitive book. It's every chapter is about a new county in this sort of British countryside, and so you find a tavern and you find some geographic features and that sort of thing. This town has a castle in it, and it's relaxing, and there's a mill, and there's balsam poplar trees, and then it talks about these different things, and it's like, oh, the town is best known as the burial place of so and so who came to this castle fleeing charges of cheating in his hometown. The royal family retains the right to quarter in the castle at any time without warning or compensation. The merchant guild has a vice-like grip on the town. Happily, the demands of the position are not as great as they might be in a town threatened by external circumstances. And if you read what Emily has written about this and you watch her talks, what she did, in addition to having these templates, was she also baked some context in as well. She sort of assigns a different, almost alchemical element to each town. She picked 5 different elements, and so some towns are of a prosperous, fertile type place with a lot of fungus growing everywhere and rites of fertility and very green and lush, and then some are very prim and proper. And so instead of just mixing all these different elements together into a sort of Markov or Perlin noise looking incoherent soup of stuff, instead she's really taking care to separate out all these sort of different aesthetic qualities of the different towns. And as such, you get interesting towns and you get interesting contrast between towns. And so I just think it's brilliant. And I'm hoping that after this, I told myself that the NanoGenMo is still going on. It's this month. It's November. I encourage any of you who want to participate. I'm going to start working in earnest on my entry after, on Monday, basically. I was like, I'll wait until I give this talk, and then I'm going to do my NanoGenMo thing. Oh, actually, yeah, I think that was pretty much what I had to put out there. I like to have a lot of audience questions and that kind of stuff because that's usually more interesting than me talking anyway. So, thanks for listening, and yeah, Noah, if you want to.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
I don't want to monopolize, but I have one. I was asking a bunch of bot makers what would be a good way to make an automated system that would create a choose-your-own-adventure text adventure with polls, and no one had any answers whatsoever. and this sounds like the closest thing is some of your favorite implementations for NanoGenmo. This one doesn't sound super linear.
No.
And a lot of it would be based on what happened earlier and then generate the next step of the story coherently.
Yeah.
Does that sound like something that's partially solved now? Almost solved?
I mean, there's two broad strategies that people use when they go to participate in NanoGenmo. The first one I would call linguistic, and so that's people being like, okay, I'm gonna train a neural network on a bunch of books, and we're gonna like try and like create something whole cloth. And then the other one I would call simulationist, and so that's more like basically I'm gonna build my own roguelike, but instead of rendering, a screen with what's happening in all these rooms, my renderer is going to be text that describes what's going on. And so I think if you took that latter approach, and also I would say for the Twitter poll, it would have to be, so you'd have to limit what the player can do at any given step, which you talked about, right, with the left, right, up, down, that kind of thing. But also, I think it would really have to be it would have to be something more like Hoplite. One of the things I like about Hoplite is there's only 3 or 4 choices you can make at any given point in a game of Hoplite, but every move you take in the game has extremely dire consequences. So there's no such thing as a no-op move, not really. So I would try and design a system where all 4 of those choices are equally, I guess, dire. Yeah.
Hi. I really think what you have to say about context is really interesting, but I would worry about the threat of something going from being contextual to being tasteless. Like, in particular, combining headlines this year seems like that could generate a lot of really terrible things. Do you put constraints on your systems beforehand, or is that something where you wait for that to happen and then address it?
It's a combination. I have a rather robust system of, I have a module up on NPM called Word Filter. It comes with a bunch of just basic word filters that I chose that I wanted to apply to all my bots, so I do that. I had running blacklists. These blacklists are different from bot to bot because in some bots it's totally okay for a word to be said, and other bots it's not. So there is automated stuff, and there is, I actually have, actually 2 headlines. I wrote a whole article about how I built a subsystem for 2 headlines to prevent it from telling transphobic jokes, because it was telling a lot of those. I didn't like them, and so I built something that detects that kind of joke in the context of a 2 headlines tweet and deletes it before it can tweet it. But it's going to be very dependent on the implementation of what you're doing, and you're never going to catch everything. So yeah, I also have basically like a page on my website that's like, here's my policy, reach out to me if you see something you don't like, and I'll delete it based on this policy. And every time people are like, oh, thank you for having a policy, and then I delete it, and it's no big deal.
Hi. So I love the bot idea so far. I'm curious as to what's your creative process where you think, oh, this might be something where a bot is good at, and then exploring what's good and what's not.
Yeah, I find things that annoy me that humans do, that are repetitive and monotonous, and I try to kill the joke by deploying basically, they're joke-killing robots is the idea. So that's basically it.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite aspect of your work, which is just to get rid of humans wasting time on things. Big thanks to Darius.
Thanks for having me.